Welcome to Community Ecology. This is the third part in the ecological series that we're offering at NIMSY. Today we're going to talk about what it means to be a community in ecological terms, and we're going to go over some important components of communities and their importance and role in the biosphere. So populations are linked by their interspecific interactions, and this impacts how they reproduce and survive as species individually and as a population of species. And so when we're talking about community ecology, um, we want to be clear about defining the boundaries of the community. And so that can be gray on the edges. So whenever we look at research that involves communities, it's very important that as an ecological research that we define the boundaries of this community. So a group of populations of different species living close enough to interact is called a community. Community structure. Community is an assemblage of these populations that live close enough to have interactions with each other. You generally have a dominant species. This is the most abundant species in the area, the highest biomass, and generally has the powerful control over occurrences and disturbances of other species. And an example of a dominant species might be a Virginia sugar maple. Then you have keystone species, and these are species that are not necessarily the most abundant, but they exert strong control in their community due to their niche. And one of the examples of a keystone species is a sea otter, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the sea otter in this video. So there's a difference between the dominant species, which is the most abundant and highest biomass, versus these keystone species that might not be the most abundant and generally aren't, but they have a strong control on keeping the balance in that community. We're going to talk about two different factors. We're going to talk about richness, which is the number of species and their abundance. And we're going to use a term called species diversity. So older species equals greater diversity in larger areas, equals greater diversity climate, equals solar input and water available. And so what do we mean by that statement when we talk about that? So when we're looking at species diversity, and we tend to have a lot of older organisms in an area, and we tend to have greater and larger diversity because it's an established community. And when we have greater diversity climate from the solar or the sun and the water available, that tends to be a fairly thriving and diverse community. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why biodiversity would be important. So why is it important for us to have biological diversity? What do we mean when we say that? Well, bio, meaning life, and diversity is looking to have a wide assortment of different organisms present. And so communities with higher diversity have some key things going for them that we really look for. And one of them is they're more productive and they're more stable regarding their productivity. And so when we talk about being productive and productivity, we're talking about that ability to utilize the energy from the sun to convert that into chemical energy, and the chemical energy being utilized through the communities. So when we talk about the word productive in biology, we're really talking about how well they're able to get energy, utilize it, and have free energy available for other processes that aren't life-sustaining but are able to help propagate their species or to reproduce for their species so that their species is able to survive from generation to generation. They're also better able to withstand and recover from environmental stresses. Lots of things that happen in the biosphere are not caused by humans. Thunderstorms, lightning, tsunamis, earthquakes, and so all of the natural phenomenon that occurs when you have a diverse community, they as a community are able to respond better and recover. That doesn't mean that every species in that community is going to be able to recover necessarily, but because they have this high diversity, you have a good chance of that community in some form being able to survive natural phenomenon. Now, there also are environmental stresses that are human caused, and we call those anthropogenic. And when something is anthropogenic, it's caused by human beings. And so I would have a question for you guys to ask, what kind of human impacts or human actions have affected communities? What kind of things could you come up with? And if we were in class together, I would probably poll some students and ask, but I'm going to give you some ideas. So pollution of all sorts, probably destruction of habitat would be at the top of the problematic list, especially in areas where we're building new things, because we tend to create what's called habitat fragmentation. So what happens is not only do they lose some habitat when we're building a new shopping center or building a new housing development, but then there are pockets that are cut off from each other because maybe they might leave like a tree line between houses in the back, which is very common in planned communities. Or in my case, they're building a new road on my road that's going to intersect my road and connect it up with other areas, and they took out about 150 acres. And so when we've seen that, that's been a very big environmental stress on the organisms here because they've lost all this habitat, but it's also cut these organisms off from each other because when they try to travel to the other habitat, they generally aren't able to make it across 6 lanes of highway. So there are these environmental stresses. I want to be clear that there are ones that are a natural phenomenon that occurred before humans were on the earth and will occur when humans aren't on the earth. And there are human impacts. And again, this biodiversity in these communities helps them have a better chance of survival. They're also more resistant to invasive species. Invasive species being species that are not native to the area, organisms that have come from outside their native range. And if you have a diverse community, they're usually able to be more resistant to being sort of taken over or invaded, so to speak. When we talk about invasive species that are highly successful, they tend to have an invasion effect on communities and populations if they are able to find a niche that they can fit into. But these diverse communities are able to be more resistant to them. So when we talk about species diversity, what are we looking at? So we're not looking at individual species. What we're looking at when we talk about species richness, we're looking at the number of different species in a given area. And so your teacher may have you go out and do a quad plot, or you guys may do one by hand, or you may look at some data. But when we look at species richness, we're looking at how many different organisms are in a general area. And so if you've gone out and done a water quality test, you know that when you go and you do sampling of these macroinvertebrates, the little bugs and little larvae that exist in water, you know that you want to see a whole bunch of different types. Seeing just one type of species is a problem. Something's going on. And then in order to get this species diversity amount, you have to add species richness, which is the number of different species, to the relative abundance. So the proportion each different species represents of all the individuals in the community. So for example, when we go out and we do water quality testing, and we go into a lake and we find 100 leeches, and that's all we find, we do not have a high species diversity going on because we only found one organism and they represent all of the species that are represented in that community. So the two factors that impact species diversity are the species richness, which is the number of different types of organisms, and then the percentage of abundance that they represent in a given area. So we're going to look at these two communities I have on, on this slide and be very unscientific here. But we're going to look at the top community I've labeled as A, and the bottom community I've labeled as B. And I'm asking you just on site, before we counted these up and looked up these organisms to see what they were, which one would be richer. And I think it's pretty apparent. I definitely gave elementary type slides here to make my point. So definitely this species B community would have a higher species diversity index number than this A community, which obviously doesn't have the volume of species as well as the diversity, because it appears that these are probably all three the same thing in varying stages of their life. Whereas this community down here has clams and different types of larvae and beetles and all kinds of different stuff. So let's look at some sample data to be a little more qualitative. And this is macroinvertebrates taken from 3 different river communities in Georgia. And you can use a bunch of different indices. They have Shannon Weiner indices for diversity. They have Simpson diversity indices. And so there's different indexes that you can use to calculate species diversity. I generally tend to work with my students on Simpson. A couple reasons for that. The Shannon Weiner requires logs, and you don't have a calculator in AP Bio or AP Environmental where you would be able to do a log. And the Simpson index does not. So I generally stay with the Simpson index, but I want you to be aware that there are other species diversity indexes out there. I just generally tend to do Simpsons. So anyway, we have Community A that has these 5 different organisms in it, and each of the organisms equals 20%. In nature, finding a Community A would be next to impossible, but it is possible, not probable. Community B has no water pennies, but it has varying diversities, varying percentages of other organisms, with leeches being the most abundant organism in this area. And Community C, which has 4% of these mayfly adults and 96% leeches. And so when we look at these, we could do the calculation using the Simpson index and come up with what's going on. But at this point, I want to have just a general conceptual conversation here. When you see leeches or worms in an aquatic environment, in general, they are very high tolerant organisms to pollution. So leeches and worms tend to tolerate a wide spectrum of change, and you need to get used to that word. Wide spectrum meaning a large range of change. And so when you see a lot of leeches or you see a lot of worms in an area and nothing else, that tends to mean that there's something going on in that system that is not good for organisms that are sensitive to pollution or somewhat sensitive to pollution. So when you see a large population of leeches or worms, that tends to tell you that there is some sort of degradation in that river system. And here, obviously, if I had to rate these on quality, I would rate Community C as the lowest quality of river because it has this huge amount of leeches and it looks like nothing else is working out there. You got a few mayfly adults that are hanging in there, but it's a very small percentage. And so when we look at the sample data and I ask which community has the greatest diversity, remember we're looking at not only the number of species, but the percentage they represent. Community A would obviously be the greatest diversity, would have the highest index number if we did the calculation for that, followed by B, and C would have the lowest species diversity index number. So a couple of little things too. Larvae, whenever you see that versus adult, these are little baby organisms. They a lot of larvae tend to be sensitive or somewhat sensitive to pollution. So you know, when we go into a river system, we're always keeping in mind what our sensitive organisms are because we're looking for those to see that the river's healthy. And we want to be sure that if we do a macroinvertebrate study, we put back those organisms. So let's take a look at a keystone species and what happens in a food system, or in this case, a food chain, when we have an additional predator added or any kind of change. So sea otters, as I mentioned earlier, are a keystone species. And if you look on the left of this graph, you can see that with the sea otters in abundance, we tend to keep our sea urchins, which are extremely aggressive predators of kelp and seaweed, under check. And what happened is we had this decline in these other populations that orcas or killer whales generally ate. And when they weren't able to get their other food source, they started eating sea otters. And that data is shown to the right of the graph. And as you see, as the population of otters declined, we had an increase in the number of sea urchins that were able to have this free energy because they weren't uh, escaping predation and were able to be very aggressive. And we had a decline in the kelp after the killer whale started plucking off these otters. And so what's important to understand about these keystone species is even though they don't represent the largest amount of biomass in this food chain and in this system, that when we start to remove them from the system, it has a huge impact on the other organisms in the system. So as you can see, the left comparing the right, once the otter population declined, the sea urchins were able to explode sort of and move from being somewhere probably around 20 to 30 grams per meter cubed, and were able to explode, so to speak, because the otters weren't keeping the sea urchin population in check because they were being eaten by the killer whales, and hence the kelp population showed a strong decrease from 1986-87, 10 years later into 1997. So let's do some math on these equations. So killer whales versus sea otters. So we can look at some of the energetics that occur when you have a predator-prey interaction. So the daily caloric requirements for male versus female killer whales is shown below. And as you can see, males require more energy. And we're going to calculate the average caloric value of a sea otter, assuming that a male orca consumes 5 sea otters each day to meet its caloric requirement. And so what that's saying is that if a male killer whale or this male orca needs 308,000 kilocalories per day, and it's able to get that energy from 5 sea otters, how much is each sea otter worth? So when we do the calculation here, and I set it up 2 ways, I set it up dimensional analysis, which is our preferred method, and then we also set it up simple arithmetic. But you take the 308,000 kilocalories and you put it per day. Every day they need 5 otters, and so what we're going to find out is that each otter is worth about 61,600 kilocalories per otter. You could also have just divided by 5 and come up with the same answer. The issue, though, is you move up in science, and we're hoping that you all stay in science fields as you move through high school science classes and into college science fields. This dimensional analysis becomes really important, especially in physics. Speaking as a former physics teacher as well, we're very lazy. So I always tell my students to do the dimensional analysis first because lots of stuff cancels out and you end up not having to deal with a lot of things. So we really prefer that you get in the habit of this dimensional analysis if at all possible. So now we're going to look at assume a population of 4 male orcas feeds solely on sea otters. So they're only going to eat sea otters to get their 308,000 kilocalorie a day requirement. How many otters are lost to the community over a 6-year period? And so what we find is for every orca, and I guess I need to adjust my blue arrows that are supposed to be crossing out these numbers, for 6 years, 1 orca is going to eat 5 otters every day for 365 days. So this 1 orca is going to eat 10,950 otters per orca. But we're talking about four orcas. So we have to do another equation, and we have to take that 10,000 and multiply it by 4 orcas over the same 6 years, and we come up with a loss in this community over a 6-year period of 43,800 otters. And so this is going to have a huge impact on the amount of seaweed, which we're going to, we would predict is going to decrease, and the sea urchin population, which we are going to predict is going to increase. So it's really important to keep that in mind that, 5 orcas a day doesn't really sound like a lot, but then you start talking about multiple orcas feeding on these otters and look at a period of time, and you end up seeing a huge loss to the population of otters in the area. So now that we've worked all that math out to figure out if the killer whales needed that many otters per day for so many years, interestingly enough, sea otters is not usually the orca's food of choice. So what happened? So a couple things happened that impacted the killer whales now eating these sea otters. Sea otters had a long history of federal protection that goes all the way back to 1911, excuse me. And so they were protected species. And so what's happened and why these orcas are now feeding on them is they have a shortage of seals and sea lions. And so the sea otters are have become an available food source because the seals and the sea lions are in short supply. They've had some fish populations decline in recent decades, as well as shortages of certain fish that have caused the decline in the harbor seals and sea lions. So it's sort of been this chain effect because there's this food web going on. And so because they've had issues with fish that sea lions and seals usually eat, they're not able to get enough energy to survive and to have more organisms to reproduce. And so because they've had this shortage, it's resulted in the orcas moving on to another food choice in order to have energy for their own survival and reproduction needs. And so that's important to understand how that can impact. Sea otters are an important part of the coastal community. The loss of sea otters affects the community directly and indirectly. So let's talk about why that is. And so the sea otters have had this huge decline, and one of the reasons why they're so important to us is that they do a really good job of keeping the kelp forest ecosystem nice and protected, because they feed on, as we mentioned earlier, these sea urchins. And they're this keystone species. They have this indirect effect on the community because they keep the sea urchins from gobbling up all the kelp, which they would do if they were unchecked, because again, as I mentioned earlier, sea urchins are extremely fierce competitors. And so what's happened, this indirect effect of this keystone species loss on the community, has been that we've had the decline in these kelp populations, as I showed you earlier on the graph before the killer whales started eating otters over sea lions and other organisms. So here's a chart, and if we were in class together, I would ask the students to examine and interpret this chart and talk to me about what's going on. But we have sea urchin biomass, which is shown on the bottom x-axis, and we have kelp density that is shown on the y-axis. And we would look at this, and this is in the Aleutian Islands. And this is when otters are present, when you have a black or a when you have a black circle or a black triangle, and the otters are absent when you have any shape that's hollow or doesn't have a fill color. And as you can see, when you have the sea urchin biomass, almost all the black where otters are present is shown where the sea urchin biomass is kept in a pretty good check at the beginning of this axis. Whereas when you start to lose your otters, as you move out across the x-axis and you see more and more hollowed out colors, you see that the sea urchin biomass is going to start to have a rise. And it rises to, it's down here, and it's going to keep this kelp density very low until you get to some point, for whatever reason, where they're starting to peak, and maybe they're losing so much kelp density the sea urchins aren't able to survive. But you can see this kelp density remains relatively high as long as the otters are present, but in their absence you start to see an increase in sea urchin biomass and a decrease in the kelp available or the kelp density in a given area. So let's take a look at some hypotheses about community structure. And this began with H.A. Gleason, and he illustrates the community as a coincidental conglomeration of species in an area. And it's basically they live in this given area because of the abiotic requirements, whether it be the soil type, temperature, rainfall, and they live in this given area together. And this shows a graphical of how they're able to tolerate and survive and operate within a food web and keep this very delicate balance. So the graph here shows the environmental gradient, meaning temperature or moisture, any abiotic factor down here. And this shows the population density of individual species. And as you can see, when you're in an area where it's a tight set of, or a small range of differences in any given environmental issue, your species are there and they tend to interact and everybody's doing great. As you move off of that and that gradient gets more away from said, like maybe a bell-shaped curve, or it skews out, you see that some species aren't able to tolerate that. And when these populations of species aren't able to tolerate that, then you have a fall off of these populations. And so this is an individualistic hypothesis. So a chance group of species, they're here together, they've got this tolerance range that they share, and they're able to live in this area as a community together. But as those environmental pressures change, you end up having organisms that are able to tolerate it and organisms that are able to not tolerate it. Then you have this interactive hypotheses, and this concept is based on the pattern of a particular species always associated with another species. And so this states that this community has this integrated unit comprised of closely related species associating with each other due to biotic interactions. And so here again, we're looking at a similar graph that's showing the environmental gradient on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, the population densities of individual species. So each of these lines would represent a different species. And it's saying that these species live together in this community, in this interactive hypotheses, because they're able to benefit from that in some way. And so this graph is looking at a particular species of plant, and most plant species follow an individualistic hypotheses, and they're loosely distributed with distinct boundaries, and they do not have mandatory relationships, whereas which would have been the graph previous. So this is where most plants are going to work. In the interactive hypothesis, we generally, when we look at an interactive hypothesis, we're looking at animals because they interact with other species and abiotic factors, and this influences the community. And what's important here is that animals have these interactive hypotheses because they can have symbiotic relationships, and so not only the abiotic factors are a factor in community structure, but now these biotic factors become a play here in terms of who they tolerate well being around, or who they have a competitive edge being around, and more animals fall under the interactive hypotheses. Community composition is constantly changing. That's what's important to understand. Community changes over space as well as time. And variation in space and environmental conditions and habitat structure is associated with predictable turnover in species composition. So let me go back and say that one more time, because this is a very important concept to grasp here. Variation in space and environmental conditions and habitat structure generally has a predicted turnover in species composition. Even in a constant or a stable environment, you're going to have this ongoing extinction and colonization that's steadily going to be turning over this community over time. Now, that amount of time can vary greatly. It can be a couple, maybe 10 or 20 years. It could be 200 or 300 years, it could be 2,000 or 3,000 years, it could be even longer than that. What changes a community the most quickly is actually natural disturbances, such as floods or fires, storms, lightning, any natural phenomenon that might come about. Okay, factors that impact communities. These are things you're probably the most familiar with from life science. Of course, disease is going to be an issue. And what I normally like my students to do is to put a plus minus next to these different interspecific interactions so that they can have a good idea. So we have competition, and I have a little activity that I play with my students, and it's got two little squirrels boxing. Okay, when you have competition between species, you're always going to have a winner and a loser. And so I would put a plus slash minus. Somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. Predation, same thing. Always going to have a winner, always going to have a loser. In disease, everybody generally loses. When we get down to symbiosis, and there are several different types of symbiosis. Symbiosis is an interaction between two organisms, and it can be mutualism, where both of them benefit. Okay, so maybe in Bio 1 you learned about like the clownfish and the sea anemone. I like to use that one because most people have seen Finding Nemo. And so you have this mutual reaction. We like to be together. We help each other out, whatever goes on. We have commensalism, where you have an organism that benefits and another organism that's essentially unharmed. So for commensalism, my students would put a plus and then a hyphen, a little slash and a 0. And that would be really important to understand that commensalism, nobody's going to be damaged, but someone's definitely benefiting. Okay, I think from life science, kids usually do pretty well on symbiotic relationships. They're very interesting. Now we get to defense mechanisms. And so we have some different ways that organisms act as defense. And I'm going to start down here with blue. In nature, blue means poison. It's actually why we haven't had blue M&Ms until fairly recently, because blue in nature means poison. And so when they do test study demographics and look at what people actually like or will eat, blue doesn't tend to do well. I mean, think about how many blue foods you eat on a normal basis from nature. I'm not talking about cupcakes from the bakery. I'm talking about things that you would get from nature. There just aren't a lot of blue things. And because this blue is its warning color, so this frog, this aposematic frog is saying, I'm poisonous. You can eat me, but I'm poisonous. We have cryptic camouflage, where organisms are able to blend into the environment with their coloring. We have organisms that look similar, that even though that this bee might not be as bad or poisonous, it looks like the poisonous version. This Batesian mimicry, where you have a palatable organism, which is a harmless species, mimics an unpalatable or a harmful organism. And that's what we're showing you here with the butterflies and the bees. And so these are the defense mechanisms that these organisms use to survive in nature. I'm sorry, the bees was the malaria. So you have two or more unpalatable species, and they resemble each other in color, and that's malarian. I'm sorry, up with the bees. Batesian with the butterflies, where you have one that's palatable and one that's not, and there's some mimicry there. The aposematic, where the color is the warning, you don't want to eat me, I'm going to kill you. And then this cryptic camouflage, where the organism is able to hide. And if you look really closely at this second picture, you can see that there is an organism down there that's coloring is mocking the bottom of whatever system that it is involved in. So those are the the 4 types of defense mechanisms. So let's look at an organism's economic niche. And so we kind of consider that every organism has a specific role in its environment, kind of like its job. And when we talk about ecological niches, we're really talking about the way of life for that species. And so the way it uses all of the biotic and abiotic resources in an environment to be a member of that environment in that community. So the example here is of an oak tree in a deciduous forest. It provides oxygen to plants and animals. It provides habitats for squirrels and blue jays. And it also removes water from the soil and utilizes other minerals from the soil. And so when we talk about the ecological niche, we're really describing how an organism or a population responds to the distribution of resources and how it alters those factors in the same way. So we're going to look at an example here of a barnacle species on the coast of Ireland. And to be clear, ecological niche is the total of an organism's use of abiotic and biotic resources of its environment. And so here we're looking at how these two different organisms of barnacles, two different species of barnacles, have these fundamental niches that they are able to colonize and utilize space in specific ways that work out to be fine for both of them to exist on the coast of Scotland. But that they have different areas where they do the best at, and they're the best at utilizing biotic and abiotic resources. Competition between organisms of different species can be direct and indirect. You can have interference, so you can have direct fighting over resources. You can have exploitative, which is competing by consuming common limited resources. And so someone could come in and exploit a habitat, maybe take over space or something like that. And then you have apparent, which is also indirect, between two species that both preyed upon by the same predator. And so let me give you an example of that, because that's also indirect. Species A and species B are both predators of species C. The increase of species A will cause a decrease of species B because the increase in A would increase the number of predators, which in turn will hunt more species B. So when we talk about these three different types of competition, interference, which is direct, where they actually like scrap it out, versus these two indirect ways of competing, exploitive or apparent, they're complex. And it's especially important to understand that the interactions are complex between organisms. And so that you understand that there are some direct ways that they can compete with each other as well as indirect ways, and how that works. So let's talk about the competitive exclusion principle. And the competitive exclusion principle is sometimes referred to as Gauss's law, which is a proposition that states that two species competing for the same resources cannot coexist if other ecological factors are constant. So when one species has even the slightest advantage or edge over the other species, it will dominate in the long term. And usually one of the two competitors will always overcome the other, leading to the extinction of the competitor or some sort of shift in behavior towards a different ecological niche or an evolutionary change, which would take much longer. And this principle has been rephrased into this: complete competitors cannot coexist. And so when we talk about competitive exclusion principle, we're really talking about the loser having one of two choices. It can relocate or it can die off, become extinct. And so this competitive exclusion principle is important to understand that if they exist in the same niche and all other things are constant, one of them is going to have to either go or they are going to become extinct over time. So let's look at the competition between organisms of different species. So these are two different types of paramecium. And they exist in the same niche. And in the first graph, you're seeing them in separate cultures. So they're in separate areas where they have their own habitat and their own food supply and everything's good. And as you can see, they're roughly similar in how they grew exponentially and then leveled off. But look what happens in the second graph when we put them in the same culture. And this is illustrating that competitive exclusion principle. The P. aurelia are obviously able to overpower or overcome the other paramecium, and so the other paramecium decline until they eventually die off because the P. aurelia are just better in that situation. So we have a couple of solutions to competitive exclusion. And this is an example of one. Can anyone look at this picture and tell me why this might be what this is, or what this might be, why this might be a solution to competitive exclusion? So this is sympatric, is how we refer to it, and it's occupying the same or overlapping geographic area without interbreeding. And so this process is actually going to allow two species to sort of partition certain resources so that one species does not outcompete the other as dictated by that competitive exclusion principle. Thus, coexistence is obtained through the differentiation of their realized ecological niches. So what they've done is they've been able to somehow partition resources. And in this case, they've been able to do that by being able to not have to outcompete each other for that. And so this niche partitioning may not occur if there is sufficient geographical and ecological space for organisms to expand into. So there's also another way that we can look at another solution to the competitive exclusion principle, and that is called allopatric. And this occurs in separating non-overlapping geographic areas. And so we're going to take a look at some data for beak depth and talk about what goes on when that occurs. So they had this partitioning here. I just want to point that out so that they weren't competing for similar resources. All right, so let's take a look at this. This is another solution to the competitive exclusion principle. This is a phenomenon called character displacement, where differences among similar species that overlap geographically are accentuated in regions where the species can occur together but are minimized or lost where the species distribution do not overlap. And so this pattern results from evolutionary change driven by competition among these organisms, among these species for limited resources. And the rationale for the character displacement stems from the competitive exclusion principle, which contends that to coexist in a stable environment, two competing species must differ in their niche in some manner, because without this differentiation, we go back to that move or die sort of principle. And so when we look at this, what we have is these different organisms, these different species of finches are finding different niches in order to maintain survival and overcome this competitive exclusion principle. So this goes back to this idea that over time, these organisms are going to tend to diverge in the characteristic that they overlap in order to create different niches for themselves. Okay, let's look and talk about succession. And I think it's really important to understand a couple things about succession. Especially in my lifetime, we've found that we've been wrong in a couple of our predictions scientifically, and I want to talk a little bit about them because I think they're pretty interesting. Succession is basically a transition of species composition over ecological time. And a lot of time when we look at succession, we generally start at what we call ground zero. So there's been a major fire, or maybe you've had a whole area wiped out for whatever reason, maybe a tsunami or a volcano or something like that. And so this is a picture of Yellowstone Park, and on the left is a picture of the what it looked like after the fires in 1988. And on the right is the exact same area, recovering through the process of secondary succession a year later. So this is actually 1989. And so a couple of common misconceptions that I want to point out here. Fire is not bad. It is a natural phenomenon in nature. And as a matter of fact, when this fire first started in 1988, it was the rangers' policy to let the fire go unchecked. And they do that because it's a natural phenomenon, overturning of environment. And what happened, though, was that the fire expanded so quickly through the park that by the end of the summer, they decided that they were going to have to put some measures in place to stop the fire, because it had just gotten so far out of hand. But in the beginning, their policy was to just let it be. And the reason for that is it is a natural phenomenon, and it is sort of a renewal of the environment. So there were species that benefited from this fire, uh, and there are organisms that do benefit more greatly from a fire, whereas other organisms don't. So fire's not bad for everyone. I hope you get a chance to play the succession game, where you get to be a different species of plant and you guys compete. It can go a whole bunch of different ways every time, and it really is such a complex process that it's very hard to predict what's going to happen and which species are going to be favored over time and why. And so we've spent some time, another area where we've looked at was Chernobyl. Back when the nuclear meltdown happened there, we thought that area would never, ever, ever be inhabitable again. And I just read an article probably 6 months ago about the fact that they have a overabundance, I think, of the wolf population, and it's shocking to see pictures, having been alive when Chernobyl happened and looking at the devastation that it created, and also following through with some of the human health impact that it had, and water quality and other things in that area. But organisms have been able to return to the area, and thrive. And so it's interesting how the complexity of the process of succession, it can go a whole bunch of different ways each time, can turn out differently. And it's important to understand that there's all kinds of abiotic and biotic factors that can impact who comes in first and how well they thrive, and how that transitions over long periods of time. So we're going to talk about, before we leave succession, I want to go over pioneer organisms and some different names you might see. So generally when we think of pioneer organisms, we're talking about bacteria, lichen, or algae. These are usually the first to come in and colonize. When we talk about a community being a climax community, it means that it's stable. It's still going to undergo change over time. All communities undergo change over time, but it's stable in the idea that even though it's going to have predictable turnover, it's still considered a stable environment when it has a lot of species return to the area, or be able to survive in that area. Primary succession begins in a lifeless area. Generally, you have no soil, excuse me. Primary begins in a lifeless area where you have no soil. Perhaps you've had a retreating glacier, volcanic activity, cross-cutting forest, or mining that's led to completely without any kind of life form there. And then you have this secondary succession where an existing community is being cleared by some disturbance that leaves the soil intact. And so you can have two types of succession. Primary, you have no soil, so you've got to get some hope that organisms come in and colonize that are going to be able to enrich that soil for you. And then you have the secondary succession where it's cleared by some disturbance, but the soil is intact. So those are the two differences between primary and secondary. Primary has no soil, and secondary has some soil intact. So let's talk about how humans impact the environment. Humans are probably the most widespread agents of disturbance. We reduce diversity, generally through habitat loss, is how we do that, and we prevent some naturally occurring disturbances by our own behavior. And there's some pretty horrible pictures. One of the main things that there's a lot of discussion about right now, as you can see, we have a forest up here at the top where they have been cut, and their ability to photosynthesize has been removed with all the tops being taken off, and the combustion of fossil fuels in the lower picture. And these lead to chemical changes. Chemical changes not only in the aquatic environment and the terrestrial ecosystems, but they also lead to atmospheric changes in chemical composition. Chemical compounds that are non-metal oxides react with water, which of course is naturally occurring through the water cycle, and they form these acids called anhydrides. And we generally refer to these as SOx, NOx are the two that we talk about. When we talk about SOx, we're talking about some sort of sulfur oxide. And when we talk about NOx, we're talking about nitrogen oxide, nitrite, nitrate. And then we also have COX and POX, which is phosphorus and carbon. And when these compounds are exhausted or expelled from automobiles or industrial sources, they react with water in the atmosphere and they make acid rain. They form these weak acids, and they can do a lot of damage. I know there have been pictures, you probably saw them in other classes of the Statue of Liberty, and how she's been impacted by acid rain, probably one of the leading symbols for looking at that. But it does a lot of damage to everything, because as the acid rain comes down through the water cycle, of course, is a cycle on Earth that flows. And so whatever is in it, unless you have a way of getting it out before it goes back through its next process, so when it precipitates and it percolates through the soil, unless we have a way of cleaning that out of there, it continues to be a component in the cycle. And so when we have these changes in pH, because the acid is going to make it lower on the pH scale, it can affect the chemistry of the terrestrial environment, the aquatic environment, as well as the atmosphere. Burning of carbon dioxide is also a contributor to a greenhouse gas, and we have several gases that are a problem in the atmosphere. Not just carbon dioxide, but water is also another issue for us in its gaseous form. Because of the properties of water that make it so useful to us as human beings, the properties of water when it's in the atmosphere are problematic, because what happens is CO2 and these other gases in the atmosphere, they trap the heat, keeping the earth warm. And so what happens is, we know that water takes a tremendous amount of energy to change its temperature. And so what happens, and one of the reasons why water vapor is considered a problematic gas, is when it gets locked in this band between the earth and where it shows this band out in the outer atmosphere, it tends to keep the heat in the earth. It's a good insulator. And so some sunlight that hits the earth is reflected, but some becomes heat, and it heats that layer up. It's kind of like a swimming pool. In May, when you first get in a pool that's not been open and they shut it down and drained it and cleaned it up, and it's super cold, and it takes until about July or August for it to feel like bath water, and then it's almost too warm. Water in the atmosphere kind of behaves the same way. So it creates this layer, and as the sun beats down on it, it's not only trapping the heat on Earth, but the CO2 in this water is continuing to increase in temperature, which creates the greenhouse effect. So this concludes our lecture, or a little video on community ecology, and thank you for joining us.